In a video I made 1 month ago, I addressed a small incompleteness in David Benatar's asymmetry. In this video I explained words like good and bad are ambiguous, and that their meaning is dependent on context. If you want to discuss the moral aspect of the asymmetry, I will need to know the metaphysical foundation for this. And because of this small incompleteness, I was unable to discuss the asymmetry. But there's great news. In Alex's new podcast on antinatalism, I have been given new information to further think about this argument. But first I want to point out that my video shouldn't be taken too seriously. David Benatar and Alex go to university. As the layman that I am, my understanding of ethics is not even comparable to theirs. I want you to remember that I'm doing this for fun, not because I think I'm contributing to anything. Alright, now let me show you what we need. Benatar. I think the crucial distinction that whether pain is, say, intrinsically bad and whether it is instrumentally bad, I think it is always going to be intrinsically bad. If you know what pain is, then you commit to the idea that it is intrinsically bad. That is not to say that there is instrumental value arising from pain. So you got a sore tooth, you got a pain in your tooth. Then that leads you to go to the dentist. And by getting the dental treatment you avoid something still worse. Then the pain has had some instrumental value. But I don't think instrumental value says anything about the intrinsic value of pain. Nor do I think you would have to be utilitarian to think that pain is intrinsically disvaluable. Before I give my thoughts on this, I will clarify a few rules. Like I said in my previous antinatalist video, good and bad can have different meaning relative to the context. So imagine we take the word bark. Now we can say the bark of a tree or the bark of a dog. Bark will have a different meaning depending on context. Now imagine your teacher asks her students the answer to 2 plus 2. Now a student replies with a good answer, 4. Depending on the context, we mean to say that 4 is the correct answer. When a person is good or bad, we don't mean to say she is true or false, but that she is moral. Let's say bark has an intrinsic meaning and will always refer to the trunk of a tree, which means we are also talking about the trunk of a tree when we say the bark of a dog. This doesn't work. We cannot say bark intrinsically means the trunk of a tree in any context, or else you run into contradiction in terms. My second rule is this. So Benatar says that during surgery, pain will be intrinsically bad since pain is always unpleasant. But pain can also be instrumentally good because surgery is for a greater good. Therefore, pain, according to Benatar, is intrinsically bad and can be instrumentally good at the same time. Now consider 2 objects. One object has the property of being a square, and the second object has the property of being circular. So far we do not run into any problems. But consider an object having the properties of being a square and the property of being a circle. An object with these 2 properties is contradictory. A square circle or a liquid ice are impossible objects. Based on these rules, we will be disequivocating the terms good and bad and see what works best. Pain being unpleasant and pleasure being pleasant are intrinsic values. Consider pain being pleasant. If pain is pleasant, then pain is not unpleasant. Thus pain wouldn't be pain anymore. Therefore it follows that pain is unpleasant. Or we get a contradiction in terms. Pain is intrinsically unpleasant. This means pain cannot be instrumentally unpleasant or pleasant, depending on context. If pain is intrinsically unpleasant and is instrumentally pleasant for some greater good, we end up with impossible objects. Thus we can derive the following from our first conclusions. It is important to know that pleasure has nothing to do with morality. Eating ice cream might be pleasurable, but that doesn't mean we ought to eat it. For a greater understanding about my metaphysical foundation, you can watch my last video called A Judgmental God. For the sake of convenience, I'm going to utilize a constructivist theory of metaethics, namely Kant's hypothetical imperative. I consider it to be a pretty valid moral system. Let's say you want a job. This require has some requirements. For example, an educational background is a requirement for getting the job you want. Therefore, you ought to go to school. Now imagine we have two people. Both of them want to live as pleasantly as possible. One person has a sore tooth and ought to go to the dentist because he wants to live pleasantly. Going to the dentist is for the greater good. The other person has nothing about his teeth. This person also goes to the dentist, but will not gain any greater good out of this. Going to the dentist for this person is unnecessary. Therefore, if he wants to live more pleasantly, then going to the dentist is not a requirement. Notice that obligations are relative to the person's needs. Obligations are context dependent, or formulated differently, moral obligations have instrumental value. Remember that morality is not caused by experience. According to the rules of contradiction in terms and ambiguity, this is the best way we can understand intrinsic and instrumental values. Benatar is saying that for the sake of a potential person, we ought not to bring him into existence. Be very wary, for the sake of this potential person. We mean to say that we don't bring him into existence because of his interests. Oughts and oughts-nots can only work relative to someone's needs. Within this context, for his sake of avoiding of having to suffer. Of course, people want to avoid pain. But should we base our hypothetical imperative on the wants of pains and pleasures? Here is the next incompleteness. I might have two needs. For example, I need a job and I need food. Which need is more superior? You can also look at it from this perspective. That my two needs can be combined. That I ought to do blank in order to get both my food and my job. I am currently working on a constructivist moral system based on Kant's hypothetical imperative, grounded on a foundational instinct within humans. You might think it is procreation, but I do not know if this is what everything is about. It is only a rough idea, but as far as I am concerned, it comes down to control, meaning and fate. It is still incomplete. Again, don't take my ideas too seriously. Scholars probably have a lot of objections to my idea, and I'm not doing this to contribute to anything. I'm just having fun doing philosophy, and I'm still in the process of learning ethics. My remaining question is, based on the fundamental human motive, and our motives to avoid pain and seek pleasure, which is more superior? Remember, pain and pleasure might be intrinsically pleasant and unpleasant. This doesn't entail we ought to avoid and ought to achieve the other. One tiny difference in needs can change the axiological asymmetry, although this doesn't mean the empirical asymmetry fails. My final point. So we have normative realism. Isn't it the case that the fact that pain is unpleasant, a reason to avoid it? Reasons to avoid pain are not obligations to avoid pain. Reasons and obligations are unrelated. If you ought to do something, you do not need reasons for it. Reasons will also be relative to the agent's needs. If you want to know more about my views on normative realism, you can watch my previous video again. I want to be clear, this video is more about what I'm currently learning. I do not mean to rebut or praise the asymmetry argument. I do not take sides, for this at least.